I don't start until I'm almost entirely clear. It's a waste of time and paint. I've wasted a lot of canvas.
She was very eye-minded, so her perception really was visual more than intellectual oftentimes.
She was really a realist. She painted what she saw.
What we see sometimes are these images that she had pride in simplifying, because her whole notion of modernism was simplification, abstraction.
To Georgia, there was very little difference between an abstract painting and a realistic painting.
That it was really about the forces of nature and the powers in nature.
Her hallmark was her power with
Design of the line and color
that gives it its own special signature.
Georgia O'Keeffe was one of the most famous American artists of the 20th century. She broke barriers in a male-dominated world and gained international acclaim during a career that spanned 7 decades.
Popularity wasn't what she was after, I don't think. She wasn't hoping to have thousands of people after her, which is what happened.
She had no interest in selling them and showing them. She had an interest in making them and expressing something.
Her art was introduced to the world by master photographer Alfred Stieglitz, the man who would become her mentor, her husband, and nearly her undoing. She became the stuff of legend when she chose to spend the last 40 years of her life in the solitude of the New Mexican desert.
And she just saw art in her world around her, whether it was the garden or the desert or the clouds in the sky.
Georgia Tato O'Keeffe was born on November 15, 1887, in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. She was the second child and eldest daughter of 7 children, born to prosperous Irish-American farmer Francis O'Keeffe and his wife Ida.
But because she was a daughter and not a son, most of the attention of the family initially went to her older brother, Francis. So she was left a little bit on her own, because her mother was really very much involved in raising these younger children. In a way, she sort of fell through the cracks of the family that way, was left a bit on her own. And she said she never minded that she sort of enjoyed being ignored in a way.
The O'Keeffe brood also consisted of brothers Francis and Alexius, and 4 sisters, Ida, Anita, Catherine, and Claudia.
The 5 sisters were like spokes on a wheel. They came from a common hub, but each one was totally different, totally independent, totally unique, and they managed to get along somehow.
Well, my mother and Auntie and Claudia were in one room. Ida and Anita were in another room. The boys were in another room, but Georgia had the best room of the house, in the front of the house with the largest window. She had a room by herself.
Catherine said she was the queen, and we all loved her, and we were her subjects, and she was a good older sister. She was very good to us. So you had the feeling that Georgia sort of led everybody around, and she decided what games they would play, and she decided how they would play it. But she was generous, and she was very loving.
Georgia did just enough work in school to be an average student. She preferred to spend her time by herself, playing with her dollhouse or walking along the prairie surrounding the family's 640-acre farm. Her mother, the daughter of a Hungarian count, saw to her cultural education, providing violin and art lessons.
She did read to them, though Georgia said she had a beautiful voice, and she did read to them at night. Mostly Western stories, it seemed, rugged stories.
O'Keeffe's mother was very interested in art and literature. She was very refined and highly educated. And as a consequence, she was very interested in having her daughters learn to draw and paint.
Those lessons consisted of copying pictures from art manuals. Young Georgia showed promise, and by the time she reached the 8th grade, she already had a career in mind.
I remember talking with a little girl, and I even remember her name, Lena Buchholz. And I said, Lena, what are you going to do when you grow up? Well, she didn't know. Well, I said, I'm going to be a painter.
But at the age of 15, Georgia's happy life in Wisconsin was turned upside down Her parents, looking to escape the tuberculosis that had killed her paternal uncles, moved the family to Williamsburg, Virginia.
Georgia was a Midwestern girl with a flat Wisconsin accent, dressed in very simple clothing, her hair pulled straight back in a ponytail, surrounded by Southern belles in ruffles and ribbons with their hair curled, all of them really being trained to become married ladies. And Georgia felt a complete outsider.
And it's interesting because that time of adolescence, she was about 15 at the time, is a time when a lot of people want to blend in. They feel it's very threatening to seem different. And she didn't. She said, I knew we talked differently. And she said, I knew door was door. I knew it wasn't dough.
As a student at Virginia's Chatham Episcopal Institute, Georgia only appeared the outsider. She was a popular and involved member of the student body. Her classmates immortalized her in the school yearbook. O is for O'Keeffe, an artist divine. Her paintings are perfect, and her drawings are fine.
And she was made the art director of the yearbook, the mortar board, and she did the illustrations. And when we look at those illustrations today, they're really quite sophisticated for a 16 or 17-year-old girl.
Well, there was a wonderful headmistress at Chatham, and she encouraged Georgia very powerfully, gave her a lot of leeway. She was the only person who was allowed into the studio anytime she wanted. And when the other students protested, the headmistress said, you know, Georgia really needs to be able to work when she wants to work. When she wants to work, she does more work than anybody else in several hours.
Georgia graduated from Chatham in 1905. With the headmistress's encouragement, she headed to Chicago, where she enrolled in the renowned Art Institute.
And Chicago, at that time, was an international Art Nouveau city, an arts and crafts city, where design was so important. And the idea that you could make objects, just ordinary domestic objects, beautiful. This feel for design was a big thing.
But Georgia O'Keeffe would always find living in a big city daunting. She felt unsure of herself, certain that her fellow students at the Art Institute had more talent than she did. Nevertheless, at the end of the school year, in her class of 29 women, her teachers ranked her number 1. Any plans to attend the Art Institute for a second year ended when the 18-year-old was stricken with a case of typhoid, so serious she lost all her hair. Georgia would spend the next year recuperating at her family's home in the Virginia countryside. Georgia O'Keeffe spent nearly a year in Virginia recovering from typhoid fever. In 1907, she returned to school, this time to the respected Art Students League in New York City. She studied under noted painter William Merritt Chase.
And he would make his students paint a picture a day. They would paint a painting, and then the next day they would paint another painting right on top of the painting they had just finished. So they weren't allowed to get too attached to their work. And they were forced to really learn to master a single brush stroke and keep moving and not get too attached to just little teeny details. And she learned a lot from him.
Chase's own style mixed traditional representation with elements of Impressionism. By the end of the first year, O'Keeffe's skillful technique won her a prize for the painting Rabbit and Copper Pot. But the 21-year-old Georgia felt uninspired and unfulfilled. She still believed she had not yet found her own voice as an artist.
I was taught to paint like other people, and I knew that I'd never paint as well as the person that I was taught to paint like. There was no reason why I should attempt to do it any better. I hadn't been taught any way of my own.
Her instructors advised Georgia to visit a small Fifth Avenue gallery. What she found inside was rocking the New York art world. It was the first American exhibition of watercolors painted by Auguste Rodin. a French modernist better known for his sculpture.
As I looked at the Rodin drawings on the wall, I thought they were just a lot of scribbles. It wasn't anything like what I'd been taught to draw.
The exhibition had been mounted by Alfred Stieglitz, known today as the father of modern photography. In his time, he was also an active champion of modern art and artists.
In 1911, Stieglitz showed Picasso. These were some of the first exhibitions in this country of those artists. Stieglitz was literally introducing Matisse, Picasso, Cézanne, and others to the American public.
He was always the center of attention. He loved arguments. If you came in and said you loved the work on the wall, he would challenge you and ask you why you thought you were equipped to like it or not like it. But he was incredibly charming, and he was terribly supportive of anybody who was trying to live the creative life.
But Georgia O'Keeffe continued to have nagging doubts about her own creative life. In 1908, the year she saw the Rodin exhibition, she dropped out of the Art Students League and stopped painting altogether.
She abandoned art for 4 years, and her logic was that if she was to imitate the work of other artists and to imitate nature, that she felt that other artists had done a much better job than she could do. So she really lost interest in pursuing her career as an artist.
O'Keeffe spent a year in Chicago working as a freelance commercial illustrator and created artwork for magazines such as Vanity Fair. At the age of 25, and only at the insistence of her sister Anita, Georgia took an art class at the University of Virginia, taught by a disciple of the American artist Arthur Wesley Dow.
Instead of laboriously copying a still life painting, Dow really believed that one could get more benefit from just deciding in a blank white rectangle where to place a door, the drawing of a door. That there would be more creativity involved in that. And he really believed that art was being deadened by this kind of academic copying.
Dow's theories were based on the Asian aesthetic of filling a two-dimensional space in a beautiful way.
And through that, I think she developed a language that she considered her own personal language. And I think any of her imagery after that is quite distinctive in terms of how she's thinking, and that is to organize on the two-dimensional surface rather than a direct imitation of reality.
Inspired anew, O'Keeffe had to find the right job to support her further development as an artist. She took classes toward a teaching credential at Columbia University in New York, then accepted a teaching job in South Carolina. Her art would again find unexpected inspiration, this time from a budding romance with a political science professor named Arthur McMahon. The only other outlet for her feelings would be in letters to Anita Politzer, a close friend in New York that she had met at Columbia.
Dear Anita, we had a great time. I have almost a mania for walking, and he did too. So we just tramped and tramped and tramped. He gave me so many new things to think about, and we never fussed and never got slushy. So I had a beautiful time, and guess he did too.
She wanted to be independent. She wanted to be emotionally independent. And she also didn't like at all the notion that women were sentimental, that they were flirtatious, that they were coy. She really resented and resisted those aspects of conventional womanhood.
Dear Anita, did you ever have something to say and feel as if the whole side of the wall wouldn't be big enough to say it on? And then sit down on the floor and try to get it onto a sheet of charcoal paper. And when you put it down, look at it. And try to put into words what you've been trying to say with just marks. Anita, I wonder if I'm a raving lunatic for trying to make these things, you know? I don't care if I am, but I do wonder sometimes.
Anita had read enough. When she saw the romance-inspired charcoals, she was so impressed, she took them to the man at the center of the New York art world, Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz, the son of well-to-do German immigrants, was born on January 1st, 1864, in Hoboken, New Jersey. He received most of his formal education in the United States, but was introduced to photography as an engineering student in Berlin.
When he started taking photographs, he quickly realized that this was a tool that he would be able to use to create really original works of art. So when Stieglitz came back to this country in 1890, he was really one of the first people here to start championing photography as a fine art and to make people realize its expressive potential.
In 1905, Stieglitz opened a gallery on New York's Fifth Avenue, known by its address, 291. He not only showcased cutting-edge photography, but also the most avant-garde art from Europe. He wanted to see America have a modern art movement of its own.
And it happened that there were many artists who did come into his circle who were really experimenting. So he got his education sort of by absorption. He was able to respond immediately to what he saw.
Dear Georgia, I went with your feelings and your emotions tied up and showed them to a giant of a man who reacted and thoroughly absorbed and got them. It was a long while before his lips opened. Finally, a woman on paper, he said. Then he said to me, why, they're genuinely fine things. I'd know she was a woman. Look at that line.
My dear Miss O'Keeffe, what am I to say? It is impossible for me to put into words what I saw and felt in your drawings. I do want to tell you that they gave me much joy. They were a real surprise, and above all, I felt that they were a genuine expression of yourself. If at all possible, I would like to show them, but we will see about that.
Dear Anita, it makes me want to keep on, and I'd almost decided it was a fool's game. Of course, I would rather have something hang in 291 than any place in New York. But wanting things hung is simply wanting your vanity satisfied. What sounds best to me is that he liked them. I don't care so much about the rest of it.
He was convinced, unlike many of his contemporaries, that women could be creative artists on a caliber equal to that of male artists. And when he saw O'Keeffe's work, first of all, he saw a kind of energy, he saw a kind of power, he saw an innovative quality in terms of the degree of abstraction.
When Alfred Stieglitz finally presented her charcoals as part of a group show at 291, he took O'Keeffe by surprise. She had recently returned to New York for a semester at Columbia University.
One day a girl said to me, is your name Virginia O'Keeffe? I said, no, it's Georgia. Well, she said, Virginia O'Keeffe is having a show of drawings down at Stieglitz Gallery. Virginia O'Keeffe, well, that must be me. I was furious, and when I got down there, I really was incensed that he should hang up my drawings and I not know anything about it. Well, we had a little argument, and the drawings stayed up.
But O'Keeffe was still an unknown artist and needed to make a living. She accepted a job teaching at West Texas State College in the tiny town of Canyon.
Anita, I'm so glad I'm out here. I can't tell you how much I like it. I like the planes and I like the work. Everything is so ridiculously new. And there's something about it that just makes you glad you're living here. You understand, there is nothing here. So maybe there's something wrong with me that I'm liking it so much.
Well, we'd see her walking a lot on the campus, and Canyon was a small town then, and the prairies come right up to town. And she walked a lot on the prairie, out on the prairie. And I remember she brought bones back. She brought skull in, and leg bones, and told us about how beautiful they were, you know, the sheen on those dried bones. She brought those in from walking on the prairie.
And also in Palo Duro Canyon, which is a little tiny version of the Grand Canyon. It's incredibly beautiful. Very beautiful reds and pinks and stripes. It's extraordinary colors there. It was just like opening a box of jewels to discover that, especially set into that empty landscape, the prairies, the open prairies.
Georgia O'Keeffe had more difficulty navigating the human landscape of an unsophisticated Texas town. She spent her time reading plays by Ibsen and books by Dante and Friedrich Nietzsche, who espoused ideas of personal freedom and sexual equality. The 29-year-old O'Keeffe found intellectual and artistic stimulation in letters she had begun to receive almost daily from a man 24 years her senior.
Little did I dream that one day Anita would bring me drawings that would mean so much to 291, as yours have meant. Nor did you dream when you did them that they would, or could, ever mean so much to anyone as they have to 291.
Alfred Stieglitz had recognized a shared aesthetic in Georgia O'Keeffe, something lacking in his 23-year-long marriage to Emmeline Obermeyer.
Well, poor Emmy was sort of typical middle-class, wealthy, rather spoiled girl. And Alfred had married her more or less at the insistence of all of his friends, saying, you should be married by now, you should have children, all the rest. And even on their honeymoon, it was fundamentally almost over. They were diametrically opposite in their tastes.
Despite his letters, it was not Alfred Stieglitz who aroused strong feelings in Georgia. It was another renowned photographer and Stieglitz disciple, someone 3 years her junior, 26-year-old Paul Strand.
Did you ever meet Paul Strand? He showed me lots and lots of prints, photographs, and I almost lost my mind over them. Photographs that are as queer in shapes as Picasso drawings.
Georgia wrote to Paul Strand that she loved him and that she loved his work. She was clearly quite interested in a relationship with him, but he was in New York, and she'd only really met him once. Their relationship was really based on correspondence and imagery.
I think she recognized that his abstract photographs were modernism. I think that this gave added impetus to her understanding that she too could use photography.
She told him that she had been making Strand photographs for herself in her head. And in addition, she was making Strand photographs for herself on paper. She was taking watercolor and putting circles within circles within circles to make these kinds of rainbow targets in a series called The Evening Star.
And she started doing paintings that were really astonishing. And they demonstrated so much freedom and so much exuberance, such an extraordinary, tender connection to the landscape and to light and to the possibilities of her medium. It's just a rainbow that she presents us with those works.
O'Keeffe had fallen in love with Texas, but not with Texans. The feeling was mutual. Her outspoken objection to America's involvement in World War I made her less than popular in a patriotic town. In 1918, a serious case of influenza forced her to leave her job in Canyon. The unhappily married Alfred Stieglitz wanted O'Keeffe back in New York, closer to him, but propriety forced him to send someone else to bring her back. Paul Strand went for his own reasons.
And he was very attracted to O'Keeffe, but he was put off by O'Keeffe's dependency. And he was put off a bit by the responsibility of taking on an artist and a woman who was seriously ill and who also really had no income of her own. And Paul decided that was not the job for him. And he writes a letter to Stieglitz essentially saying, I can't handle it, she's all yours.
These last 10 days have been very full ones, possibly the fullest I have had in my life. Of course, the important thing has been O'Keeffe. She is much more extraordinary than even I had believed. In fact, I don't believe there ever has been anything like her. Mind and feeling very clear, spontaneous, and uncannily beautiful.
At the urging of Alfred Stieglitz, 30-year-old Georgia O'Keeffe moved back to New York in the summer of 1918. The 54-year-old photographer arranged for her to live in a Manhattan studio, giving her the freedom to use her time solely for painting.
I think the way he must have come to her was as somebody who admired her work, who understood what she was doing, was irresistibly drawn to her as a woman. And it was very clear to her that his life, his family life, was barren.
And she fell in love with him, and within a month he had moved in with her. In a very comical, something like it happened one night kind of scene, because they hung a blanket in the middle of the room between two beds and all the rest, so they could persuade everybody that they weren't really having an affair, which of course they were.
I think she was flattered by his attention. I think he was the most important person in the New York art world, and he was interested in her. I think she was in love with him, and in another way, I think it was also a bit of a Faustian bargain that she would be his mistress and she would have the career that she wanted.
The two lovers encouraged each other's endeavors in art. When Alfred wanted to photograph Georgia, she readily agreed to pose for him.
I never realized that what she is could actually exist. Absolute truth. Clarity of vision to the highest degree. There is complete harmony. I feel she is much finer than I am.
He had an idealization of women which wasn't always very feet on the ground. And putting them on a pedestal had a problem attached to it, as O'Keeffe discovered. He would make her prominent as an artist and bring her as a woman. And woman in his vocabulary always had a capital W. You could always hear that even when he spoke. So she fit into what he was beginning to speak about as important for people who were understanding art, to understand about society.
By 1918, Sigmund Freud's theories on sexuality and the unconscious were becoming widely accepted in the United States. Alfred Stieglitz was strongly influenced by these radical new ideas. He saw all artistic expression as related to gender and read all of O'Keeffe's work as manifestations of her own sexuality.
And so Stieglitz, when he saw this watercolor, was fascinated by it and very much of the opinion that O'Keeffe was expressing this feminine character and really a sexual dimension of her physical being. What I think is at the time O'Keeffe was playing the violin, and the scroll-like, it has a very sort of spiral form. So this spiral form is really the scroll of the violin.
O'Keeffe also found artistic expression of feelings inspired by music.
You can see this in a work called Blue and Green Music, and this shows us that she was very susceptible to synesthesia, that one sense can trigger another sense, that hearing and seeing are in many ways linked.
In 1921, Alfred Stieglitz organized a major exhibition of his work that included photographs Georgia O'Keeffe had allowed him to take of her posing in the nude. These images would have a profound and lasting influence on how the art world perceived Georgia O'Keeffe and her work.
But it was only after this exhibition of his own photographs that Stieglitz then exhibited O'Keeffe's work again in 1923. And O'Keeffe found that many of the critics, when they looked at her paintings, their descriptions were much more as if they were talking about O'Keeffe's body than about the paintings themselves.
Stieglitz reveled in the attention O'Keeffe was receiving. But Georgia found his promotion of her work using the nude photographs distasteful.
I don't like publicity. It embarrasses me. But as most people buy pictures more through their ears than their eyes, one must be written about and talked about, or the people who buy through their ears think your work is no good and won't buy. And one must sell to live, so one must be written about and talked about whether one likes it or not. It always seems they say such stupid things.
O'Keeffe could not bring herself to speak out publicly against Stieglitz, but she found other ways to regain some sense of control over her image and her own life.
After 1923, you see a significant change. She becomes much more reserved. She's much less open, much less giving in the photographs, and seems quite literally to be protecting herself.
So she really played down that sexualized issue by becoming extremely androgynous in her appearance, very severe, very controlled. And of course, ironically, that's just as provocative as the sexualized interpretation of her. So you have sort of these two polarities in terms of a public image. And the real O'Keeffe sort of slips between the two. And she liked that. She liked a kind of mystery about her person.
She made her own clothes before she moved to New York. And some of the pictures you see of her with, even with a slightly frilly blouse, which you don't associate with her at all, were things that she had made. And later on, she recognized the drama. And he certainly recognized the drama. And when they had matching capes and matching hats, they were very much aware of how they looked as a couple.
Not only did Georgia change her appearance, she also became determined to paint images depicting reality, not abstract forms that could be interpreted as sexualized self-expressions. She and Alfred, along with the entire Stieglitz clan, spent summers at Oaklawn, his family's summer home on Lake George in upstate New York. Although Alfred's wife had refused to grant him a divorce, his family embraced Georgia as the woman who had finally made Alfred happy. But O'Keeffe did not share the same warm feelings for them.
They were difficult. There isn't any question about that. And I would have been bored out of my mind if I'd had to spend my entire time with them. The two sisters fought with each other all the time, and Alfred sometimes fomented their arguments so that he could get a laugh out of it. It was just a circus. And O'Keeffe wanted to have quiet.
And Georgia was eventually put in charge of the household. But she did it very systematically. I mean, she saw about the meals, but she didn't like all the commotion, and there was no privacy.
To further escape the oppression of the Stieglitz family, Georgia turned an old shanty on the Stieglitz property into her own private studio. Not even Alfred was allowed inside. When the two were alone at Lake George, they spent their days working apart from one another, and their evenings sharing what they had done.
They worked together and yet separately on the subject matter around Lake George, like the skyline, the lake itself, the barns on the Stieglitz property, the fruit and vegetables that she grew in his garden, things like that. But they used the subject matter as a kind of conversation.
So that I think there's a symbiotic and reciprocal relationship between the two. The way I would describe that is, you meet people in life where you feel like you've known them before when you meet them for the first time, because there's a kind of relationship that you have the same something. There's a chemistry there that you feel very comfortable with them.
Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz shared an aesthetic vision and a deep commitment to one another's work. Though their dialogue through art would only last 10 years, their love and respect for one another would last for the rest of their lives.
He is a forlorn little soul. I do what I can. but I have to keep some of myself or I wouldn't have anything left to give. Giving is difficult, almost too difficult. Do not think from what I write that I'm blue. I'm having one of my few great days of the year when there is no one around and I can really breathe. Being alone is good for Stieglitz, too.
In September of 1924, Alfred's first wife, Emmy, granted him a divorce after 6 years of separation. 3 months later, Georgia O'Keeffe married Alfred Stieglitz in Cliffside Park, New Jersey.
I don't think she was interested in getting married when Stieglitz was finally single, but she did because he wanted it. Again, because I think she felt she could still maintain her independence, even though she was married. She certainly wasn't intending to take on his name. She was not going to become Mrs. Stieglitz.
Despite her ambivalence toward the institution of marriage, Georgia was still committed to their relationship and deeply in love with Alfred.
She and Alfred were pretty sexy in the beginning of their marriage. I remember they're leaving the dining table together to have a run upstairs.
Although she was now married to Stieglitz, Georgia O'Keeffe was not the only artist receiving Alfred's attention. By 1925, the European moderns that he had introduced to America 10 years earlier, Matisse, Picasso, and Rodin, were well established and in demand by commercial art galleries and museums in the United States. Alfred Stieglitz now sought that same appreciation for his own group of American artists.
He did a show called The Seven Americans in 1925, which was really a statement on his part that he was moving toward supporting the work of American artists and really feeling that all American artists could develop an imagery that was as important and relevant as the work of European artists.
And to a great extent, he felt that American art was being shortchanged. So the Intimate Gallery was specifically devoted to promoting the work of 7 Americans. And those 7 Americans were Stieglitz and O'Keeffe, but also John Marin, Arthur Dove, Marston Hartley, Paul Strand, and Stieglitz had a slot reserved for the X person.
What he thought distinguished Americans really had to do with the underlying connection with nature. I think that he would have seen something very dehumanizing about European modernism and something very human and very rich and warm-blooded about American art.
To further emphasize his point, Stieglitz also promoted O'Keeffe as an American-born artist free of any European influence.
Stieglitz presented her as a native, naive American artist because he wanted to foster an American art out of American life without what he called that damned French flavor. And it's true, O'Keeffe never did go to Europe in those years, but naive she was not.
Everyone has many associations with a flower. You put out your hand to touch it, or lean forward to smell it, or maybe touch it with your lips, almost without thinking, or give it to someone to please them. But one rarely takes the time to really see a flower. I have painted what each flower is to me, and I have painted it big enough so that others would see what I see.
The 7 American shows at the Intimate Gallery marked the unveiling of the work for which Georgia O'Keeffe would become world famous.
The fact that she's organizing these compositions abstractly, that in fact she has captured the essential rhythm, the essential undulation, the essential basis of that color, and then it intensified it according to the needs of her painting and her observation, is what allows us to come in.
They were surprised, and they looked because they were big, but if I'd done just as well or even very much better and it had been small, they wouldn't have looked.
She was looking for something that would say intrinsically flower, like flowers, which are very sexy. They had organs, And this was made into something entirely alien to what she was thinking.
Once it was there, she could never eliminate it. It was there. So the critics wrote in that vein and said, this is a woman whose erotic life is very important, and that was something that gave her an enormous feeling of distaste, but she couldn't do anything about it.
Her husband continued to present his vision of her as a great American female artist. Though she disagreed with his views, Georgia did not confront him about it. Instead, she sought to define herself on her own terms and to be recognized solely on the merit of her work.
She became very interested when she moved into the Shelton Hotel in the 20s in depicting skyscrapers in New York. She was fascinated by them. And when she first started depicting the skyscrapers, Stieglitz said to her, well, you know, this is really a male domain. So she insisted on her skyscrapers being included in an exhibition of her own work in 1926. And one of her skyscrapers sold immediately. And she said that was the last she ever heard about not being able to paint skyscrapers.
I feel that as a walker, that she absorbed a lot of things about the beat of the city. And often in her night paintings, you have in the lights in the windows this kind of syncopated beat. If you look at them closely, I mean, they feel very jazzy. They are full of photo-optic details. You have buildings which should be seen straight up, but they're not. They're toppling toward each other. And this is convergence, a characteristic of what happened to view cameras. When they were pointed upwards, now you could compensate for it, but what she liked was the aberration.
O'Keeffe found more inspiration in the city than enjoyment. She preferred the solitude of Lake George, when she and Alfred could be alone. But he found the isolation difficult, liking instead to be the gregarious center of attention.
Georgia was, I think, almost quite shy. She enjoyed talking to people, but she was not what you would call a coffee clatcher.
I have seen her actually set up a party for Alfred and his friends, and then she would go to a concert and leave him to talk and talk and talk and talk because she just couldn't stand it.
And she was talking about a difference of opinion between herself and Stieglitz on something with visitors around, and she said, you would know I was right, but you would believe him. And that has always made me laugh because it's true of O'Keeffe. It may have been true of Stieglitz, but it's very true of O'Keeffe. She could say something in such a convincing way that you would believe her, even though objectively speaking you could say that the facts were wrong.
One thing Stieglitz tried to convince her of was that she was in fragile health. Regardless of whether she really believed him, she did what he told her to do.
Being a hypochondriac, which he was, this was something that he also superimposed on Georgia. She had to stay in bed for this or for that or whatever else she was told to by Alfred's continual worry about her health.
She would say, Alfred wants me to be in bed all the time. That's the when he feels happiest because he's in control of me and he can help me and take care of me.
Georgia found the atmosphere surrounding Lake George and the Stieglitzes stifling. She wanted to be with her husband, but she found it more difficult to return every summer to what she called the claustrophobic greenery. She later wrote, "It is lovely country with many trees, but it is not for me."
The men didn't like my color. My color was hopeless. My color was too bright and too, you know, I liked colors. And I thought what most of them used was pretty dirty. And I thought, well, now I guess I'll paint a picture of the shanty. I'm going to paint a dirty picture too, and I bet they'll like it. So I painted this building, and it went to town, and Mr. Phillips came in and bought it the first day. And they all thought, well, now maybe she can paint after all. She's getting down to some ordinary, some real color now.
There's a dark palette, and then there is her palette, which is totally ecstatic and brave with impossibly combining the colors that she does in order to make the kind of music that she does with color. She was proud of that distinction.
People cried when they saw her work for the first time. I'm not talking about art historians, I'm just talking about the people who came to see her work. She had a profound effect on people. Now, this is deplored nowadays, but still, it did happen.
She did paint very powerfully the world of the emotions, and that was what maintained and sustained a popular response to her work that has never diminished.
During the 1920s, the cost of an O'Keeffe painting was already thousands of dollars. But Stieglitz saw to it that her artwork remained accessible.
A lot of her work was sold for very modest sums to people who were simply overwhelmed by it. And Stieglitz felt this is somebody who ought to have this painting. And so the work would go to a woman who'd never bought a painting before in her life, but just was dumbstruck by this purple petunia that O'Keeffe had painted.
He was very concerned with placing the work with people or in places where it would be genuinely appreciated. And if that meant turning down a sale, he was happy to do it.
He'd come home and tell me how somebody came and wanted a particular painting, and he didn't let them have it. And this would go on maybe till long in April, and I'd say, well, Alfred, you know, it'd be nice if I made my living this year.
There were a few paintings that she didn't want to part with, and it wasn't so much sentiment as work. Something she wasn't satisfied with, something she wanted to do over, something she wanted to do better. And it was Stieglitz who didn't want to part with things. I mean, he felt almost that these were his children.
When O'Keeffe and Stieglitz were married, she was 37, he was 60.
She had made it very clear a number of years earlier that she wanted children very badly. So I think at that time she hoped to have children. And Stieglitz didn't.
My mother was the one who tried to persuade her that she had to have a child, that it was an experience that she ought to go through as a woman. And she was constantly saying that the two of them would make such a wonderful child. She had just had my sister, I guess, at that time, and motherhood was everything. So I think there was a time when O'Keeffe really thought, jeepers, what am I missing?
And Alfred made it clear to Georgia that it would be very hard for her to have a career as an artist and have children, and that she had to make a choice.
She felt that her life as an artist was much more highly defined, and she was living the creative life, and it took on more and more substance for her and became a perfectly legitimate substitute for one that included children.
Georgia O'Keeffe had little time for anything other than painting. Beginning with her first exhibition in 1923, she would have a show every year in one of Stieglitz's galleries for the 22 years she and Alfred were married.
I think she liked a show in the sense that she could see what she had done. You know, a show puts everything up at once. It isn't like looking at one painting on the easel and then another painting on the easel. And it was a way of evaluating what she had done for herself.
By 1927, Georgia O'Keeffe had reached a level of success unprecedented by a female artist. That year saw her first significant income from the sale of her work. She sold 6 paintings for a total of $17,000, a sum less than Picasso or Matisse would earn, but unheard of for a woman. She became the sole breadwinner of the family and depended on Stieglitz less and less for personal and professional direction.
She was nuts without ego. Both of them. Obviously, it was something that made their life together difficult. I think they were both geniuses, and two geniuses together. You can't be a productive genius without being egotistical. You're the center of the world.
As she establishes what we today call boundaries in her relationship with Stieglitz, he starts looking for that kind of support and affection and adoration elsewhere.
Alfred fell in love with 20-year-old socialite Dorothy Norman. She was young, attractive, adoring, and married. She was also very willing to be molded by Stieglitz, something Georgia O'Keeffe had outgrown.
Both of them sort of pretended that they weren't really having an affair. I think they had fallen in love with one another, but they also wrote letters to one another discussing ways in which their affair really helped their marriages, helped keep them vital and alive and therefore present for their partners. You know, I don't know about Dorothy Norman's husband, but Georgia was having none of it.
She felt that each person had responsibility for her own happiness, and she was responsible for being happy. She could not go to Stieglitz and say, I require you to do this. I demand that you stop doing that. She didn't think one person had the right to ask another person to stop doing something. She thought if she were unhappy, it was up to her to resolve it.
To escape the mounting tension at home, Georgia O'Keeffe and Rebecca Strand, the wife of old flame Paul Strand, traveled to New Mexico in the summer of 1929. Both women were having marriage trouble and went west at the invitation of writer and socialite Mabel Dodge Luhan.
The summer of 1929 out here was extraordinarily productive. She did a series of cross paintings that depict the cross in front of the landscape. They're very, very beautiful pictures. She does paintings of Taos Church. Very powerful expression.
O'Keeffe chose a perspective she felt offered more potential for abstraction: the back of the church. The West also represented freedom. Georgia learned how to drive and bought her first car, a black Ford sedan she named Hello. She enjoyed a degree of independence not possible for her in New York.
She has fun. She drinks wine and goes dancing and plays cards, and they go horseback riding in the mountains, and they go skinny dipping in the river, and she just has fun being with Mabel and Rebecca and Mabel's husband Tony. And fun was getting to be in short supply in New York. I think it was very rejuvenating for her. And she also began to see that maybe she could go there more often and possibly have another life.
I know that many people, men and women, love Stieglitz and need the thing he has to give. I feel that I have two jobs, my own work and helping him to function in his own way. And by helping him, I sometimes mean I don't want to get in his way.
In 1927, 63-year-old Alfred Stieglitz had met 20-year-old Dorothy Norman. The two had been having an affair since she became a regular visitor to the Intimate Gallery. Through Alfred's tutelage, Norman would become an amateur photographer and writer. Georgia later described her as having a mouthful of hot mush.
O'Keeffe understood what was going on, felt deeply hurt by it, I believe. I also don't believe she ever challenged Stieglitz, but withdrew from the situation into her work.
Alfred, in a way, was operating in a kind of denial. I mean, he kept telling everyone that he was not having an affair with Dorothy Norman, but the letters indicate that he clearly was.
He tried to make friends of Dorothy and Georgia, and it was a totally absurd campaign that went through the summer. We were in stitches. I mean, for those of us who had some sympathy for it, just thought Alfred was out of his mind, which he was.
True to her character, O'Keeffe would not confront Alfred directly, but his affair helped her to realize she had done things his way for far too long. Against his wishes, she accepted a commission to paint a mural in the newly constructed Radio City Music Hall.
I think that was to express her irritation at being told pretty much that she ought to continue in whatever vein she was doing because that was earning her excellent reviews and money. And it was also, it came at a moment when she wanted not to be so exactly under Alfred's control. She needed to express her own sense of her power.
Stieglitz was very hostile about the whole project, very antagonistic, very critical, completely unsupportive of her for doing it. So she was under continual assault, both domestically and professionally, from Stieglitz. And then at the end, the wall wasn't properly prepared, and she ended up by not being able to get the work done when she wanted.
Deeply disappointed in herself and frustrated with the failure of the Radio City mural project, Georgia retreated to Lake George, where she suffered a nervous breakdown. Georgia O'Keeffe stopped painting entirely. On February 1st, 1933, she was admitted to Doctors Hospital in New York, suffering from psychoneurosis, the repression of unconscious conflict.
When he was told by the nurses that he couldn't come and visit his wife because simply the sight of him upset her to such a degree that they were afraid for her life, then he understood. Then he was devastated. He was completely undone by the understanding of his own responsibility for this. Then he quit seeing Dorothy Norman, and then they had a very different relationship.
Georgia spent nearly 2 months recovering in the hospital. By the following year, she resolved to spend her summers in New Mexico, a place she'd visited every year since her first summer in Taos 5 years earlier. She had recently discovered a landscape that gave her a reason to paint again, in a small town called Abiquiu.
As soon as I saw it, that was my country. I'd never seen anything like it before, but it fitted to me exactly. It's something that's in the air. It's just different. The sky is different. The stars are different. The wind is different. I shouldn't say too much about this because other people may get interested, and I don't want them interested.
And within the openness, there's this simplicity in the shapes and forms, and it can really draw you in if you go into the actual landscape to create like she did.
What's interesting about them is that when she first started depicting the forms in New Mexico, the critics thought that they were surreal because of the colors, and because she would juxtapose a landscape form with a shell or a flower or whatever, or a bone. And what she was doing was holding the bone up to the sky and painting what she saw.
She really wanted to connect her observation with her control over the medium, and she saw one in service of the other. Why did you paint the hills red? Well, it was the way I saw it. But what is seeing if not connecting vision and emotion? And Georgia O'Keeffe's seeing was colored by that connection in her mind's eye.
While most of the country was suffering through the Depression, Georgia O'Keeffe lived a world apart, finding freedom and inspiration in rural New Mexico. She purchased a small house on what was known as Ghost Ranch. It would become her isolated summer retreat.
There were really a lot of difficulties for a woman being out here by herself in the 30s. No electricity. She had to start the pump by hand out there with a gasoline motor to charge up batteries, no refrigeration. She had to drive 70 miles to Santa Fe or unpaved roads to buy her food, and it really took a lot of courage and determination to be able to just get established out here by herself.
She liked to drive fast, and she liked to be the first, and if there was a car in front of her, she would get ahead of that car. And she usually was driving 90 at least.
women artists or women anything didn't take off and leave their husbands and go off and do their own thing, which is exactly what she did. And she did it all her life, whether it was painting or taking long walks in the desert or whatever.
I am divided between my man and a life with him, and something of the outdoors. That is in my blood, and that I know I will never get rid of. I have to get along with my divided self the best way I can.
O'Keeffe continued to spend her winters with Stieglitz in New York, but she no longer endured summers at Lake George, with a family and a landscape that bored her. She looked forward with increasing anticipation to her time in New Mexico.
As a wife, she understood that it was putting a tremendous pressure on her marriage, and she understood how the rest of the world would see that. And she painted that beautiful, powerful picture of a stone, and it's called My Heart. Someone asked her why it was called My Heart, and she said, because I thought it looked hard. And she understood that was how people saw her. It was not the way she saw herself. She saw herself as loving Stieglitz, giving up 2/3 of her life to him, but reserving 1/3 of each year to go to a place that really nourished her as an artist.
It is very hard for me to realize that within a few hours you will have left. But there is no choice. You need what your place will give you. Yes, you need that sorely. And I'll be with you, cape and all, and you'll be with me here.
I see Alfred as an old man that I am very fond of, growing older, so that sometimes it shocks and startles me when he looks particularly pale and tired. Aside from my fondness for him personally, I feel that he's been very important to something that has made my world for me. I like it that I can make him feel that I have hold of his hand to steady him as he goes on.
She saw that there was a housekeeper staying with him in New York as well as in Lake George, so that his everyday needs were taken care of, and they were fairly simple. Then she felt that it was okay for her to go. As soon as he was really ill, she was back.
On the morning of July 12, 1946, Alfred Stieglitz suffered a massive stroke. He was rushed to Doctors Hospital in New York. Georgia hurried home from New Mexico once she had heard the news. She was with him when he died, early the next morning.
She had spent the night ripping out the satin lining of the coffin because she couldn't stand the idea of his being in pink satin. She found muslin, and she herself relined the coffin.
And when she is at the funeral, she is stoic and quiet and not crying. And Dorothy Norman, who is also at the funeral, is absolutely devastated and crying hysterically.
After Alfred's body had been cremated, Georgia O'Keeffe scattered her husband's ashes on the Stieglitz property at Lake George. She kept the location secret from everyone, including his own family. In 1949, after devoting 3 years to distributing Alfred Stieglitz's vast collection of art, Georgia O'Keeffe left New York and made New Mexico her permanent home. She bought a second residence in Abiquiu, once she convinced the Catholic Church to sell it to her.
I thought that door was something I had to, I don't know why, but I had to have that door. It had a garden, and I was tired of eating wilted carrots and wilted lettuce that I had to go clear to Santa Fe to get when I lived at the ranch. I wanted a garden. It took me 10 years to get it. They wouldn't sell it. But I stayed here, and I kept trying. If you work hard enough, you can get almost anything.
Well, she would insist on getting it done the way she liked it, or she would very often jump in and do something herself. I mean, with cooking, for instance, she was not a person who knew much about cooking, but she liked her food, and she liked it a certain way, and to get it that way, she had to learn to do it herself. So she would do it herself, you know, with great precision and delicacy and subtlety, and then she would teach it to another person.
She also made her own yogurt, totally unlike anything you buy in the store. It wasn't sweetened. You had to add sugar if you wanted or put fruit on it. She could only go to the store once a week, and if she forgot anything, she had to go without. So she was very careful with her food, and if you didn't eat it, it was there until you ate it.
Though she cherished her time alone above all else, Georgia O'Keeffe was no recluse. She enjoyed the company of friends, be they artists, photographers, or local residents of Abiquiu. She also liked camping in the desert. She collected rocks, which she called her treasures. Her favorite rock came from photographer Elliot Porter.
There was a famous rock, which we called the Venerable because it was such a perfect rock, and it was black, and Elliot found it and let Georgia see it, and of course she wanted it. And this was a game between the two of them for years after that, because he'd have it for a while, and then she'd come down and visit them and take it. And then she'd have it up at her house, and he'd come up to her house and take it. And it went back and forth. So it was called the Venerable, and I don't know where it is now.
One night after dinner, she said, "How would you like to rub rocks?" The children and I said, "Well, yes, thank you. That would be very nice." She had banquettes. We all sat there like crows on a rail with these rocks and polished them by hand. She didn't have a tumbler. But it was so soothing. I mean, here we were all sitting there almost hypnotically, you know, rubbing rocks.
Walking on the floor was like walking on light gray velvet. And I asked her about it one day, and she said that once a year she had the neighborhood women come in and they'd boil hot water and flour and pour it on the floor and just rub it into the adobe. It always had this beautiful suede look to it.
Like in the dining room, there was a fireplace, but it was on eye level, and it was arched, so that as you sat having your meal, you could watch the fireplace. But she had Indians working for her, and they would literally make a pyramid, and under the pyramid they would have made shavings of wood. So there was no paper involved, and they were like a magnificent piece of sculpture.
If you went into her bathroom and happened to look in the cupboard, you would see that it had sheets in it, and each area was marked. Double bed sheets, single bed sheets, totally organized. Her studio was wonderful. It was very carefully and precisely laid out. Her brushes were in jars on top of files.
There'd be these long work tables here with hundreds of brushes and her materials out, but when she was done painting, then everything was put away. She used to say, I have to get my clothes in order in my drawers before I can go out and paint.
But nearing 70, Georgia O'Keeffe was no longer the prolific painter she had been while Alfred Stieglitz was alive.
They were very close in terms of being interested in each other's work, so there was no one who meant to her what Stieglitz did in terms of looking at the new work. There was no one to do it for, except herself on a sort of unconscious level.
She was already established as a painter, and she didn't feel as driven to establish herself. She felt that if she was going to say something, it had to be worth saying.
O'Keeffe spent much of her time during the 1950s and 60s traveling the world, to Asia, Europe, and South America.
The traveling opened up fresh, new ideas for her, like rivers seen from the air, because she became very interested in the way the earth looked when you look out of an airplane window, and she would make little sketches on cocktail napkins.
And when the plane got above the clouds, those were the clouds she saw. And she did a number of paintings based on that. And so, I mean, it wasn't she just made it up. It was, she saw it and painted it.
O'Keeffe had chosen to live her life in relative isolation in New Mexico. Though she continued to keep her finger on the pulse of the New York art world, she did it from a distance, shunning the attention an artist of her stature would surely receive.
She was known, but I think because of her isolation. She didn't play the gallery, museum game, going to openings, coming to New York. She didn't play the game.
By and large, most of the people in the village had no idea who she was in the art world. They just knew she was Miss O'Keeffe. You know, she was part of the community.
In 1970, the Whitney Museum of American Art mounted a major retrospective of her work.
People saw the early work, they saw a development in her work, they saw an originality in the early work that they hadn't seen, because I put in a lot of those early drawings and watercolors. And so they saw O'Keeffe as a pioneering person in terms of American abstraction in a way that she hadn't been seen before.
Record-breaking attendance at the Whitney made the retrospective one of the art world's first mega shows. As it traveled across the country, it attracted a large number of young people, especially women. Georgia O'Keeffe had become a household name, and she could not have cared less.
I don't start until I'm almost entirely clear. It's a waste of time and paint. I've wasted a lot of canvas.
She used to map out her paintings very carefully before starting them. She was very organized about the way she painted. She wasn't an artist who would just pick up a brush and spontaneously splash about until something came up.
She used color chips on little pieces of board. She put down her palette completely. She rearranged everything, her color harmonies, through use of these color chips before she put any paint on canvas.
I think the paint chips are extremely important in revealing aspects of her attitude toward her materials and how she prepared her materials and how she was obsessed with them and involved with them, and they had to be perfect.
Georgia O'Keeffe had painted her vision of America for more than 50 years. By the time she was 80, she had gained a worldwide reputation as a pioneer in 20th century modern art.
We had a little show at Bryn Mawr the year after the Whitney when they gave her the equivalent of an honorary degree, and one of the people at the opening said to her, how do you think being a woman has affected your art? And she said, well, I don't know, because she said, I've never been anything else. And, you know, this was, again, very typically O'Keeffe, you know, very down to earth, very direct. She wasn't going to be made into a feminist icon if she could help it.
Georgia O'Keeffe had no association with the feminist movement of the 1960s, nor did she know the woman most associated with it. When Gloria Steinem came to New Mexico to visit O'Keeffe, she was turned away at the door.
She had become a persona, and each person seemed to have a different point of view, a different way of looking at her, depending on that person's needs. I don't think they really knew or understood Georgia at all.
It's really after Alfred Stieglitz dies and Georgia moves to New Mexico that she develops the identity that we, as contemporary viewers, know. The hauling the bones around the desert, the reclusive artist living in the midst of this adobe house, the black and white clothing, the way she was always photographed with a very severe, unsmiling pose.
But friends came to know a much different O'Keeffe than the persona she cultivated for public consumption.
She wore clothes of all different colors. She had pink kimonos. I would visit her and she'd be wearing 3 layers. One would be yellow, one would be white, one would be pink.
She had a marvelous, engaging sense of humor and liked to laugh and liked to be teased. It was wonderful because you'd see this very stern person who looked like the very rocks that she was looking at, very severe, and when she laughed, the whole face would break into 1,000 smiles and laughter. It was just the whole thing would light up.
Despite attempts to keep her life private, Georgia found herself the object of unwelcome attention.
She used to get this weird kind of fan mail from all kinds of people that really she found rather frightening sometimes. And it may be one reason why she was so defensive about her solitude and keeping people away, because people would write to her as if she were the Delphic oracle, you know, and that she could solve all their problems if they could only come and have tea with her.
O'Keeffe's closed-door policy to strangers was widely known. Still, people came. Most were turned away, even when accompanied by locals.
So we went over, and she came out. She looked at this gentleman who wanted to ask her questions and said, you came to see Georgia O'Keeffe? You've seen my front? She turned around, you've seen my back. Good day. You know, she told me at that point, you know, that wasn't a good thing to do, to bring strangers there.
People kind of got in the way of, as she got older. And I can remember her saying, I don't need people.
At the age of 82, Georgia O'Keeffe was diagnosed with macular degeneration, a gradual loss of central eyesight. She had to function using only her peripheral vision.
I think very much she woke up, you know, for what was beautiful that was in front of her that she was going to work on. And so I think when she became blind, it just was unbelievably terrible for her because she couldn't see what she'd always seen.
As she continued to lose her ability to see, she turned more and more to creating with her hands and to making pots and so forth. And although I think of those forms as afterthoughts, and they're really not strong contributions in terms of her creativity.
As Georgia's eyesight diminished, she depended more and more on the help of others to complete even the simplest tasks.
And she had been relying on the village girls of Abiquiu, but they didn't have the kind of commitment to her career and to her that she needed to survive. And Juan was educated, he was an artist, he was attractive, they shared a kind of sardonic, droll sense of humor, and she liked him, and he liked her.
John Bruce Hamilton, or Juan as he was called, was a 26-year-old potter who came to Georgia O'Keeffe as someone who could help her do odd jobs around the house. He soon became indispensable to her.
Juan was her eyes and ears later in life, but he teased her and she loved it. He was like her grandson. She just really adored Juan.
When Juan came into the picture, everyone was apprehensive and didn't really know what this young man's motives were and feeling very protective of O'Keeffe. So there was a bit of some animosity. And I think it stems from people just from their fear that this young man would come and take away their O'Keeffe.
What Juan did for her, which I admire him for, was to take the brunt of that. He would protect her by being the person to say, she can't see you, she's not going to see you. And he did play that role in a way for her. But it was to protect her.
Just sit there naturally like you're talking to us.
And I'm talking to the pot?
No, to us.
Oh, to you?
Yeah.
I can take this off. I don't have to have
I thought it looked rather nice.
All right, let me have it. Feels good.
It's a cool morning.
She did tell me once that he made her, for the first time in many, many years, feel like a woman. I mean, I think she dressed for him and tried to be perfect for him. He kept her life interesting at the end.
Juan Hamilton was not only George's assistant, but he also took on duties previously done by others. He served as her representative in the art world, handling the sales of her paintings, traveling with her, and helping with her later exhibitions. His presence heralded a new phase in her life. At the age of 90, the artist could no longer survive by herself.
I can see shapes It's as if my mind creates shapes that I don't know about. I can't say it any other way. That I get this shape in my head. And sometimes I know what it comes from and sometimes I don't.
She often talked about having forms in her head, colors in her head, and I think that she did, and she found those parallels in the natural world, and that she was quite remarkable in that ability to maintain that creative effort.
And I think it's a measure of her courage as a person and as an artist that she tried to paint with somebody else's help, and then she did pottery. She did ceramics with somebody else's help, simply to try to go on creating objects that gave her aesthetic pleasure.
And together we accomplished a lot, and I think it was that working together and being able to produce a couple beautiful books on Alfred Stieglitz's work, to be able to watercolor, to make pots. It was a mutually beneficial relationship, and was based on respect, admiration, and cantankerousness. Summer Days was the favorite painting in the Whitney show that went across the country.
Though she published books on her own work, Georgia O'Keeffe offered precious little insight into her creative process.
And she had very little to say about her own paintings. She'd have them hanging in the Abiquiu, and you'd say, "Oh, isn't that wonderful?" I'm sure she agreed, but she never enlarged on what it was or about.
You say that in your colors and shapes make more statements than words. And you have a great deal of work represented in this book of your life.
Well, there it is. Instead of words.
One thing that's interesting about O'Keeffe is that she spoke a lot to the critics, and she actually wrote her own piece in 1976, Georgia O'Keeffe. She never really talks about what her art is. She would deny somebody else's interpretation of it. She will say what her art isn't, but it's very hard to pin her down on what she thinks her art is.
She had a great personal respect for her art. To her, it was far more valuable than money. She never really sold more in a year than she needed to live on. She'd rather have the paintings.
She only sold a painting if she needed money. Otherwise, she kept them. If people wanted to sell them sometimes, she bought them back. They were her paintings. They were her children.
In 1980, Georgia O'Keeffe turned 93. Her time was spent walking around Ghost Ranch when she felt up to it, and caring for her pair of chow dogs.
She seemed to be very much in her own world, often when I saw her in, say, 1984 or 85. Very happy, but not as tuned in to the world around her as she had been when I first met her.
In March of 1984, Georgia became ill while visiting her sister Anita in Florida. Juan Hamilton moved her to Santa Fe, where she could be cared for more closely.
Towards the end of her life, there were 10 of us who took care of her around the clock. She was never left alone. She wasn't in pain. Sometimes her back hurt, but she never complained. She was always very gracious. And I would just try to make her comfortable and brush her hair and help her brush her teeth. It really was quite an honor. But it was sad, too, to see her fading away.
On the morning of March 6, 1986, a very weak Georgia O'Keeffe was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in Santa Fe. Her assistant, Juan Hamilton, was vacationing with his family in Mexico. Georgia O'Keeffe died later that day. She was 98 years old. In accordance with her wishes, there was no memorial service or funeral. She was cremated, and her ashes were later scattered by Juan Hamilton among the New Mexican landscape she had called home for more than 40 years.
I think she wanted to be remembered as a great painter. I think she wanted her top paintings to stand up with other people's top paintings of other generations and other periods.
At the time of her death, Georgia O'Keeffe possessed 400 of her own paintings and an estate valued at $70 million.
My husband Paul asked her if she was going to build a museum, or did she ever think about it, and she was quite indignant and said, well, I did the paintings. I'll be darned if I'm going to build the museum. That's not my job. Someone else can do that. And then she smiled. She would always say something and then smile, like she had a big secret.
In 1997, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum opened in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It is the only major institution in the United States dedicated to the work of a female artist.
What we do as a museum is to focus on O'Keeffe, but because she is such an icon and such a person who's been lifted out of time, people tend to see her out of time and out of context. And one of the things I think is really important for people to realize is that she had a history. She was a person, a human being who lived in a specific time, and to organize exhibitions that reveal that dimension of her work, I think, is really important.
I have been very fortunate, much more fortunate than most people. For instance, I can imagine myself being a much better painter and nobody paying any attention to me at all. But it happens that the things that I have done, the things that I've been doing have been in touch with my time so that people have liked it. But I could have been much better and nobody noticed it. Much better, I'll say, as a painter. You see, a painter is one thing and a person in a way is another thing.